All right. Welcome to the lunch hour, everybody. This is Gavin McGuire, event trader. Got a pretty quiet day at the moment here, so we'll take a quick spin around, and then I'm going to bring in Carmine Ateo here just to run down what could be an important week, just given the lack of volume that's out there on the headline front, though, for trade in particular. There's a couple of key events going on that we're going to want to continue to monitor, and like I said, we're going to bring Carmine in just to kind of run through everything on that front. Taking a look around the markets, though, not a lot of action to speak of. We got the S&P up slightly at 0.2% on the day, and this compares to the NASDAQ, which is down about 0.12% in early trade. Really been dead out there. No one looks to be getting overly aggressive at the moment. We've seen the VIX slide back to that 12 level here. And then just taking a quick look at the Russell as well. That's probably up a little, the most on the day, up 0.3%, but it'll be interesting to see if any of those headlines from lamenting about the Fed raising rates a little too quickly for his liking has an impact there on the dollar, and thus a knock-on the IWM. Taking a quick look at the put-call ratio, that's sitting down at that 0.8 times area. It really hasn't moved too much. It opened up the week at about 0.75, and it's moved slightly higher, but hardly anything to really be overly concerned about. So again, there's just simply not a lot out there, and this is kind of what we're expecting going into Labor Day weekend. Now, with this light volume tape, there's always the chance of some headline noise, and that's why we're going to be bringing in Carmine Ateo on to talk real quick about what's going on the trade front and to make sure everyone's prepared for the type of headlines that we could see. As we saw on Friday, doesn't take a lot to get the market moving, given that low volume again, and there was reports about China and the U.S. stepping up negotiations in order to lay out a framework for some sort of a deal to be had by Friday, or by mid-November. So with that, Carmine,
how you doing today, Gavin?
Doing good. How are you doing?
Good.
Okay, so obviously we have a list of events on the docket for this week on the trade front. So I figured we'd just kind of go through on the chronological side, so that way we could prepare people on a day-to-day basis. But so far for today, Monday, we have two things online, right? We have the Commerce Department hearing that's kicking off. It's going to be 6 days of hearings, from what I'm to understand. They have about 350 companies that are going to be talking, and that's going to be a primary event going on from the 20th to the 23rd, and then they are having another meeting on the 27th, and these should be running from about 9:30 a.m. to 6 p.m. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. They have about 300, as you said, 350 witnesses. It's not a schedule for 3 days, but a lot of people don't think they'll be able to get through 350 witnesses in that amount of time, so it'll probably more than likely extend it to early next week.
Okay. Now, you have said that these are not going to be webcast. It's basically going to be reporters passing along stories.
Yeah, and just to kind of give you an expectation about what to expect from this, as you recall, the Commerce Department put out a plan to put out $200 billion on tariffs on Chinese imports to the U.S. Most of the companies that are going to be testifying, or stakeholders that are going to be testifying, are going to be against the proposal. So we may see a lot of reports saying that so-and-so company is against this proposal because of this, or so-and-so stakeholder is against this proposal because of this. That's to be expected and shouldn't be that surprising to anybody, because most of the people that are going to be testifying at this hearing are going to be representatives of companies that may be impacted by the tariffs. And this is a thing that the Commerce Department has to do when the Commerce Department gave or rather when Congress gave the President the authority to do these tariffs, it came under stipulation that they have to get public comment from all these officials. So they're basically doing what they have to do, but I wouldn't read too much into it. If you see a lot of companies saying negative things about the tariffs, I wouldn't read into that the Trump administration is in a reverse course. They're going to do what they want to do, and depending on if they have a deal with the Chinese.
Okay, so I mean, this is basically just a chance for these companies to air their grievances, but you think that the motion's kind of been set or already moving forward on this?
Well, the key thing is going to be these talks, though. Whether or not this $200 billion goes into effect. The review period ends September 5th, so we'll have the meeting that we're going to talk about next out of the way by then, and hopefully by then we'll get a more firm date and time for the November meeting between President Trump and President Xi, and that will maybe lay the groundwork for some type of deal so we can avoid the $200 billion in tariffs. But as of now, the review period is supposed to end September 5th, and based on prior history of these things, they usually take about 2 to 3 weeks before the tariffs actually go into effect after that. So that'll be put into late September if they do go into effect. But again, there are meetings to be held, and so that's kind of up in the air right now.
Okay, so we have these 4 days of hearings, which we'll probably see some off-sided comments, with a lot of them dealing around concerns about the rising costs from these tariffs. Now, in your preview, which you posted under the FXI ticker for anybody that wants to follow along, Carmine posted this at 8:10 Eastern time this morning. You lay out a number of areas that are going to be potentially impacted by this, including food ingredients, auto parts, some chemicals, and aluminum. This is just another built on aluminum.
Yes, as you recall, the Trump administration already put some tariffs on aluminum, but I guess these will be an add-on. I found it a little curious that was included because I thought that was already included as part of the other tariffs, but I don't know if they're doing different types of aluminum that they weren't covered before, but they're included on both lists. They're just different types of aluminum, I guess.
Okay, and then we also have paper products, apparel, which will be key given the busy earnings season this week for some of the retailers that we'll be looking at, and of course electronics, which has certainly been weighing in on the semiconductor space, and one could see that via the SMH trading as of late. So we have this going on. We got one other item today that certainly doesn't seem to be garnering as much interest, but that's the U.S. follow-up meeting with the EU, correct?
Yeah, so as you recall, I think it was earlier this month when President Trump met with EU Commission head Jean-Claude Juncker at the White House, and they agreed to I wouldn't call it a deal, but a trade framework, I guess, to where Europe would purchase more liquefied natural gas from the United States, and in exchange they agreed to hold off on any future tariffs, including the auto tariffs, and they agreed to try to find a resolution to the steel and aluminum tariffs. Those steel and aluminum tariffs are currently still on, but so this meeting, from what I understand, is going to be providing each side with an update of where they stand, because, as you know, Gavin, the EU has to get approval from all their parliamentary members before they can execute any parts of this trade agreement. So that's probably that's probably going to be the main discussion about this meeting, is to see where they are with these approvals.
Right, and as we know, it could be a very laborious and bureaucratic task to get things through the EU. So there's no chance of any sort of rolling back on the aluminum or steel tariffs.
I wouldn't expect it. If there was, it would be a definite positive for them, and it would probably see a pretty big market reaction. But I wouldn't expect that coming out of this first. It's going to be a longer process, and at some point, once we get all the agreements and Europe starts to purchase LNG, then the Trump administration will probably think about removing those tariffs. But right now, they want to see some concrete action out of them before they do that.
I know you've been concentrating mostly on China, but do you know where we stand with Europe and the auto tariffs? Do you know what the next step is in terms of expectations for either the Trump administration to move forward with that increase in tariffs that they've threatened at all, or are we basically kind of in limbo until we see some of these talks come to fruition?
Right. When President Trump and EU Commission head Juncker met, they agreed to put the auto tariffs on hold pending this agreement. Now, if this agreement falls apart, the Trump administration has the authority to put these auto tariffs on if that's what they want to do. So it all hinges basically on this agreement and trying to get these approvals done with the EU, because the Trump administration wants to see the LNG flowing basically before they either remove the steel and aluminum tariffs or agree to other contingencies, such as giving the Europeans a concrete exemption from any auto tariffs that they may put on in the future against other nations. So.
Okay, so going through the progress of the week, we're looking at possibly today seeing some maybe upbeat comments about the two sides working together, but we should not be expecting anything concrete. On the Commerce Department hearings, we could probably expect to see some headlines of some red flags being raised on concerns around rising costs for a lot of these players in the market. And again, in that FXI prelim that Carmine did, he lays out some of the different industries that we should be keeping an eye out on. And that's going to bring us into Wednesday and Thursday, which is when we're going to have the U.S. and China actually sitting down to the tables. Now, from my understanding, it's a 9-member delegation from Beijing coming, with the top player there being Vice Commerce Minister Wang Shouwan, and he's going to be meeting with Treasury Undersecretary David Malpass, correct?
Correct. And one thing to note here, I'm not trying to put anybody down or anything, but the Treasury Department doesn't handle actual tariffs. So any of these agreements that David Malpass agrees to will have to go through the USTR, the Commerce Department, and most importantly, President Trump.
Right. So, I mean, it doesn't sound to me like either one of these sides really has been given an edict of trying to reach any sort of agreement with anything. This is more or less just trying to reopen the negotiating sides between the two, correct?
Correct, exactly. And that's a very good way to describe it, as the U.S. is set to, repeat basically the demands that they made earlier, which is, just to refresh everybody's memory, is to as a reduction in the U.S. trade deficit, to remove subsidies and trade barriers, and to talk about the China's yuan increase in their currency. So those are the topics that are likely to be discussed at this meeting.
Okay, so and basically the backdrop of this meeting, that's kind of a fight between the two negotiating sides, right, Carmine? I mean, we basically have his National Economic Advisor, Larry Kudlow, looking for I don't want to say a softer approach, but certainly not keeping the hard line as his U.S. Trade Representative Lighthizer and David Navarro. So that's kind of the internal battle going on with the administration, correct?
Yeah, exactly. And just to give you, just to point our listeners to a good story that has a background on that, there was a New York Times story that was published last week on the U.S. and China's. Was more focused on the battles between the Chinese government and the battles in between the U.S. government on these trade talks. And it was really interesting because it kind of laid out how China is, is worried that a longer-term dispute with the United States could hurt confidence in their economy. And the article also shows the length in which the state-run media is trying to put a rosy scenario on the trade war. One of the interesting nuggets was that the state-run media was ordered by the government not to use the phrase "trade war" when talking about this. So they are trying to put as rosy a situation as possible. And there is debate in Xi's government whether they should be more aggressive towards the U.S. or try to cut a deal. So the same thing that's happening in the U.S. is happening in China, as basically as the disagreements within the administration.
Okay. Now, again, these are lower-level talks, certainly a good starting point, but it's unlikely that we're to see any sort of meaningful headlines coming out, right? I mean, my assumption is that the best-case scenario is that we'll see, it talks about the two sides have seen eye to eye on a few areas and agree that they need to continue to talk and are working towards some sort of final conclusive decision.
Yeah, exactly, and it would be a positive too if we get a firm date as a summit between President Trump and President Xi. Right now, the Wall Street Journal reported that tentatively they're trying to meet on the Asia Pacific Economic Forum, which is November 18th. There's also another report saying that they could meet at the G20, which is at the end of November. So if we get like a firm date and a firm setup as far as the summit's concerned, that would be a small positive as well. The wild card, as you noted in your event preview this morning in your day ahead, was that if they make a breakthrough and they decide to put the $16 billion worth of tariffs on hold, because the meeting is a day before these tariffs are supposed to go into effect. So that would be a big positive for the markets, as you said, and I agree with that. That if they do put those tariffs on hold, I wouldn't be expecting that, but that's something to keep an eye out for. If you're looking for a big upside move in some of these names, especially those Chinese ADRs, to see if if you see that story come across, that's going to be very positive for them.
Okay, and then just to recap that, on Thursday the 23rd, as Carmine was just noting, that second tranche, if you recall, we had the $50 billion in goods that the White House administration was laying tariffs on. They moved ahead with $34 billion, and then there's the remaining $16 billion in goods that they decided to push forward with, and that officially goes in on August 23rd. So what I was talking about, what Carmine's mentioning, is if we do see progress made between Schoen and Malpass in their meetings on Wednesday and Thursday, then there's a small outside chance we could see a postponement to this 25% rate of tariffs being put on the $16 billion of goods. That is arguably the best case scenario in what should otherwise be a lot of white noise on the trade front. But again, as Carmine was saying, the potential for a lot of noise out there. So again, given that light volume tape, it's something that we're going to want to continue to keep an eye out on. And as Carmine laid out, there's a number of areas this week that we'll want to continue to follow. So we'll be providing the play-by-play as these headlines come out, and certainly any sort of color and specific plays that we might see emanating from the headlines that come out. But overall, Carmine, outside of this week, what are some of the things we should be looking for in the more in the near term, in the next 5 to 6 weeks, say?
Well, I mean, like I said, the September 5th is going to be the end of the comment period for that $200 billion in tariffs. It's getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but once that comment period ends, it usually takes 2 to 3 weeks based on history. I'm just basing this based on the steel and aluminum tariffs, the $34 billion and $16 billion, when the tariffs actually go into effect. So keep late September on your radars as well for a possible initiation of these tariffs if things don't go well at these meetings. Can
they delay that till after the November meetings?
They could, and that would be a positive as well if the Commerce Department comes out with it. That's a very good point, actually.
Right. It just seems to me that would be a negotiating point that the administration would probably want to go into talks with in November if that was the case.
Absolutely.
So, all right. Well, Carmine, anything you wanted to add here?
Oh no, that's pretty much it.
Okay. Well, as per usual, thanks for coming on and discussing this with us. Carmine continues to write on this subject, and you could catch his commentary. He's usually posted under the FXI or the SPY, right, Carmine?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so please feel free. He also lays out a number of plays that you want to keep an eye out on. And again, we'll be having updated comments throughout the course of the week, but this should give you a primer on exactly what to expect here and what some of the potential headlines are out for this week. So, Carmine, thanks again for joining us, and we'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Gavin.
Okay, take care.
Bye.